There's a pattern inside almost every professional organization that almost no one talks about openly. The smartest employees, the ones who understand the business the best, who see problems before they become crises, who have the most accurate read on what's really happening, are often the quietest people in the room. And here's what makes it dangerous. Their managers look around the conference table, see no raised hands, no objections, no pushback, and conclude that everything must be fine. The team is aligned, the plan is solid, everyone is on board. They're not reading agreement, they're reading the aftermath of a process that already happened, quietly, slowly, invisibly, where smart, observant employees decided that speaking up was no longer worth it. This video is about that process, how it starts, why it accelerates, and what it tells you about the hidden psychology of every workplace you've ever been a part of.
The workplace problem. Most organizations operate on an unspoken assumption that silence means comfort. If an employee isn't complaining, they're satisfied. If they're not raising objections, the plan must be sound. If they're not pushing back, it means there's nothing to push back on. This assumption feels reasonable on the surface. In everyday life, we generally speak up when something is wrong. So when people stay quiet, the natural inference is that things are okay. But in professional environments, that logic breaks down. And it breaks down for a very specific reason. The workplace is not a neutral environment. It is a political environment. It is a social environment. It has histories, hierarchies, unwritten rules, and consequences that operate far beneath the level of any formal policy. And smart employees, the ones who are most perceptive, most observant, most analytically rigorous, are also the ones who are best at reading all of those invisible dynamics. They are not staying quiet because there's nothing to say. They are staying quiet because they've already run the calculation. They've already assessed the costs, and they've already reached a conclusion that most managers never hear directly. Speaking up here isn't safe. Not physically unsafe, professionally, socially, reputationally unsafe. The consequences might be subtle, a slight change in how they're spoken to, being passed over in a meeting, having their credibility quietly questioned. But smart employees notice these things, and they remember them.
First, hidden truth. Here is the first thing most leadership development programs get completely wrong about this pattern. They frame employee silence as a motivation problem, as disengagement, as apathy. The solution they prescribe is usually some version of create a culture of openness, encourage feedback, do a pulse survey. But that diagnosis misses the actual mechanism. When a smart employee goes quiet, it is almost never because they stopped caring. It is because they started calculating. Behavioral economists have a concept called the cost-benefit calculation, the idea that every decision involves an implicit comparison of what you gain against what you risk. This isn't something people do consciously. It happens fast, automatically, based on pattern recognition built from past experience. And for a smart employee in a workplace that has repeatedly shown them that honest input leads to uncomfortable outcomes, being talked over, being labeled as difficult, watching their ideas get ignored or attributed to someone else, the brain begins to associate speaking up with loss. Not big, dramatic loss, small, accumulated loss. The loss of standing, the loss of energy, the loss of the feeling that any of it matters. And the rational response to repeated loss isn't to keep trying harder. It's to stop.
which means the silence you're observing isn't a lack of engagement, it's the outcome of a very efficient learning process. And that raises a darker question we'll come back to. What exactly did they learn, and who taught them?
3 workplace stories. Story 1. The analyst who stopped raising red flags. Sarah was an analyst at a mid-sized consulting firm. She was sharp, methodical, and early in her career had a reputation for asking the right uncomfortable questions at exactly the right moments. In her second year, her team was running projections on a major client engagement. Sarah spotted a financial error, not a small one, an assumption buried in the spreadsheet that would materially change the final recommendation. She flagged it in the team meeting. Her manager acknowledged it briefly, said they'd look into it, and moved on. The error was quietly corrected in the next version of the model, but never mentioned again. Sarah received no acknowledgement, no credit. Her manager later presented the corrected model to the client as if it had always been that way. 6 months later, Sarah found another issue, this time in a timeline that was being pitched to a different client. She almost said something. Instead, she pulled up the memory of that first meeting, the way the conversation moved past her point without pause, the absence of any follow-up, the correction that appeared anonymously in the next draft. She stayed quiet, not because she didn't care, because the lesson had been delivered clearly, even if it was never stated out loud. Your job is to find errors before they leave the building. It is not to raise them in a way that causes friction in the room. Sarah spent another 18 months at that firm. She never flagged a public issue again.
Story 2. The developer who learned the company only wanted validation. Michael had been a senior software engineer at a tech company for 3 years. He was technically excellent, the kind of person junior engineers went to when something didn't make sense. His company had a process they called an architectural review, a meeting where technical decisions got discussed before implementation. In theory, it was where dissent was supposed to live. In practice, Michael had watched the same pattern play out 5 or 6 times. An executive or a director would propose a technical direction. The review meeting would happen. Engineers who disagreed would raise concerns. Those concerns would be heard, noted, and then politely overridden. The original decision would proceed, and the engineers who raised concerns would find themselves quietly sidelined in the next planning cycle, not explicitly, not formally, just less consulted. By year 3, Michael had learned what the architectural review was actually for. It wasn't for debate, it was for documentation. It was a formal record that the process had happened, not a space where the process could genuinely change outcomes. So Michael stopped engaging substantively. He attended, he nodded, he said things like, "That makes sense," and "I can see where you're going with that." He'd effectively checked out of the decision-making culture of the company, while still being one of its most technically capable people. The director who ran those meetings thought Michael had matured, become less reactive, more collaborative. Michael had simply stopped believing his contributions mattered.
Story 3. The high performer whose silence preceded departure. Emma was a product manager at a well-funded startup. She'd been there since the early days, had worked across almost every function, and was one of the few people who held the full organizational history in her head. Over 2 years, she had gradually become quieter. Her skip-level manager noticed it during a one-on-one and asked directly, "You seem less vocal in leadership meetings lately. Is everything okay?" Emma said yes. She said she was just being more selective about when to weigh in. She smiled and mentioned a project she was excited about.
3 months later, she submitted her resignation. Her manager was shocked. To him, the last 3 months had felt like stabilization. Emma had seemed fine. She'd been productive, responsive, professional. What he hadn't seen was that Emma had already made her decision long before those 3 months. The silence wasn't a temporary state. It was the final stage of a process that had been running for almost a year. She had raised concerns about the company's product strategy. She had flagged team dynamics that she believed were slowing down execution. She had asked, more than once, about her growth path. Each time she had received a variation of the same response. Yes, we hear you. We'll look at it. Things are moving. Nothing moved. So Emma stopped investing emotionally in the organization's future. She stopped contributing ideas she was no longer sure would be used. She started planning her exit, quietly, professionally, invisible to everyone around her. By the time her manager asked if everything was okay, Emma had already answered that question for herself.
The deeper psychological. There's a principle in behavioral psychology called operant conditioning. It's simple. Behaviors that are reinforced tend to repeat. Behaviors that are punished or that simply produce no result tend to stop. We usually talk about this in the context of rewards, praise, bonuses, promotions. But the principle works in reverse just as powerfully. When an employee speaks up and nothing happens, no acknowledgement, no follow-through, no visible change, that absence of response functions as a kind of punishment, not in a dramatic way, subtly, but cumulatively. Over time, the brain learns this behavior does not produce an outcome, and behaviors that produce no outcome get extinguished. This is why well-intentioned managers who say, "My door is always open," are often baffled when no one walks through it. The invitation isn't the variable, the history is. There's a second psychological concept at play here, and it's called social learning theory. Developed by Bandura, it simply describes the fact that people don't just learn from their own experience, they learn by observing what happens to other people. Smart employees, by definition, are attentive observers. They watch what happens to the colleague who challenged the manager's pet project. They watch how the team reacts to the person who raised the budget concern in the all-hands. They build a model of how this organization actually operates, underneath the stated values, underneath the town halls, underneath the feedback surveys. And that model, once built, governs everything. The third piece is psychological safety, a concept popularized by researcher Amy Edmondson. Her research across dozens of teams found that the single greatest predictor of whether a team would share concerns, identify errors, and engage with difficult problems was not skill, not compensation, not structure. It was whether team members believed that speaking up would not lead to interpersonal punishment. The important nuance: psychological safety is not built through policy. It's built or destroyed in individual moments. The way a manager responds to the first uncomfortable question sets the psychological contract for every question that follows. One dismissive response, one public correction, one idea attributed to someone else, and that contract begins to erode. Smart employees notice. They adjust.
The contrarian insight. Here is an observation that tends to generate some friction when people first hear it. Most organizations assume they have a problem with employee voice, that people aren't speaking up enough, that they need better channels for feedback, more psychological safety initiatives, more open-door policies. What they don't acknowledge and rarely examine is that the silence was often taught, not deliberately, not maliciously, but systematically. Every time an idea was ignored without acknowledgement, every time a concern was heard and then quietly buried, every time the person who asked the hard question was subtly excluded from the next conversation, the organization was delivering a lesson, and the sharpest people in the room were the most efficient learners. This leads to the first contrarian observation. Organizations often don't lose smart employees when they resign. They lose them the day they stop speaking. The resignation letter is just the formal confirmation of a decision that was already made, sometimes months or years earlier. The productivity was there, the attendance was there, but the real contribution, the critical thinking, the risk identification, the honest assessment had already quietly left the building. The second observation is harder to hear, and it's directed at managers. The silence you're frustrated by is frequently a response to a signal you sent. The most common complaint from leaders is that their teams don't push back enough, don't surface issues early enough, aren't forthcoming with problems. What rarely follows that complaint is a serious examination of what happened the last 3 times someone did push back. Not what the manager intended to communicate, what the employee learned from what happened. There's a meaningful gap between those two things, and smart employees live in that gap.
Practical framework. Whether you're a manager trying to understand why your best people have gone quiet, or an employee trying to navigate a culture where speaking up feels risky, there are 3 signals worth paying attention to. Signal 1. Track the gap between input and outcome. This applies in both directions. Managers should ask themselves, when someone on my team raises a concern, what visibly happens next? Not internally, not I take it seriously. What does the person who raised it see happen? If the answer is nothing or something vague, the gap is open. That gap teaches silence. For employees, track your own ratio. How many times have you raised something substantive and seen it change something versus raised something and watched it dissolve? If the ratio is consistently skewed, that's real information about how much your input shapes outcomes, and it's reasonable to adjust how much you invest. Signal 2. Watch what happens to the first person. In any team or organization, there's usually one person who is willing to say the uncomfortable thing first. Watch carefully how that person is treated, not just formally, but socially, conversationally, in the small moments. Are they respected for the honesty, or are they quietly managed? The answer tells every observant person in the room exactly what the rules actually are. Signal 3. Distinguish between an invitation and a contract. My door is always open is an invitation. It has no weight unless it's backed by a consistent history of what happens when someone walks through that door. The psychological contract, the implicit agreement about what is safe, is built through repeated behavior over time, not through statements of intent. If you want smart people to speak, the work is in building that contract, one response at a time, one conversation at a time, one moment of genuine acknowledgement that their input changed something. That's not a culture initiative, it's a daily choice. There's a specific kind of organizational dysfunction that's almost impossible to detect from the outside. The dashboards look fine, the meetings run on schedule, the deliverables are submitted. People say the right things in the all hands. But the smartest people in the building have already done the math. They've calculated what speaking up costs, observed what it costs others, and arrived at a quiet but irreversible conclusion. This organization doesn't actually want to know what I know. And so they attend, they perform, they produce. But the thing that makes brilliant people genuinely valuable, the willingness to name what others won't, to identify what others can't see,
to surface the risk before it becomes the crisis. That stopped being offered a long time ago. The most dangerous room isn't the one where people are arguing. It's the one where everyone is nodding, and the 3 most perceptive people in the building stopped arguing 6 months ago, and nobody noticed. When smart employees stop talking, organizations don't lose their voice. They lose their ability to hear the truth.